Hey, everybody, and welcome to another Ask Professor Paranormal. I'm parapsychologist Lloyd Auerbach, and I'm here to provide whatever you need in terms of information. So feel free to hang on one sec. Just realized I didn't turn my volume off. Please feel free to ask questions. It's good to see some people here. Hope you all had a good Easter weekend, and if you celebrate Passover, that you had a good Seder this year. So. As always, I am here to answer questions, and I just noticed something else going on here. Let's see if I can get, there we go. Try and do that. Get rid of the chat over on the side there. Yeah. Okay. So it's being taken care of. That's good. There we go. All right. So I see some very familiar people here. We have Carl Richardson also from Midnight Frequency Radio, who's with us. It's a podcast I recently did, but a bunch of regulars. So good to see everybody. So, of course, this is, as a reminder, this is for you to ask questions. But as you're thinking of them, I'll just mention that we do have the new courses up for the Ryan Education Center that start at the beginning of May. And I'm teaching 3 classes coming up. John Kruth is teaching a course called 8 Important Studies in Parapsychology. So each week he'll take a deep dive into a type of research or a specific case, like the Seaford poltergeist case, and really do a very, very deep dive into those topics. Jimmy Aiken is teaching the Introduction to Parapsychology course. So if you've never had a really good overview of the field, that is that's a good starting point, or even one that just might remind you of things. And then I am teaching Human Consciousness and Survival Studies, looking at the evidence for life after death, for the afterlife, for survival of bodily death. And so I'll go through all the different phenomena and the studies that have been done, the kind of the research findings, the controversy, even within the field of to whether or not consciousness can exist after death, all of that. That's an 8-week class. I'm also teaching a course called Paranthropology, which is parapsychology and anthropology. It's a cross-cultural look at psychic experiences and beliefs in a variety of cultures from the anthropology perspective, because anthropologists have been reporting on this stuff for a really long time, maybe not calling it psychic, although sometimes they do. And that also is an 8-week class. And then I'm teaching a 4-week class in May called The Practical Guide to Psychics and Mediums, which is renamed from another class that I did a few years ago. But the idea of this course is, if you are an investigator of the paranormal and you either do work with or would like to work with psychics and mediums in your investigations, and how to best work with them, how to find them, that's one thing I cover, that whole process. If you're a person who likes to go to psychics and mediums and you'd like to find a good one, and you'd like to understand how the reading is. In other words, is this a good reading? And maybe even, is it possible this person's a fake? So is there real psychic content in that? That's something else that I cover in the class as well. So it's a fun class for me to teach. It kind of draws upon my background in parapsychology, especially having worked with so many psychics and mediums over the years, but also draws on my background in magic and mentalism, since I've been in that world for almost as long as I've been in parapsychology, kind of side by side in many respects. Thank you, Paul, for mentioning that. So if you're interested in those, that's great. And also, I will mention, I will have the link up on my website at some point, and I'll be putting it into social media too. I don't have the specific. Well, actually, I think I do. Maybe I do have that. I did get a link today. So let me just double check here. Yeah, I do have a link. So I'm going to put a link into the chat here, which is for a lecture that I'm doing on how to find and how to choose a psychic or medium and assess a reading, kind of like a 1-hour version of the class that I'll be teaching. That's for a site called Ghost Education 101. I'm going to be doing that April 15th. You'll see that if you click on that link, later on, of course, you'll see that. It's not up live, obviously, because it's going to be a live lecture, and then the recording will be there as well. But it'll be April 15th at 9 p.m. Eastern. Okay. And I'm also going to be putting up a couple other links this week in on my media page for upcoming for recordings of some of the podcasts that I've done, such as Midnight Frequency Radio. So I've got to add a bunch of things still for upcoming interviews I've just done, and others as well. One in particular I should mention, it's coming up. I think it'll be released on Thursday, so I'll have the link for that. That'll go in there. Is with a man by the name of Ryan Singer, who's also a comedian, stand-up comedian. So we had a really fun time, since I have a little connection to the comedy world as well. Okay. All of that is a preamble to letting you folks ask your questions or bring up topics if there's anything in particular people would like to discuss. And thank you, Paul, for that. I mean, Carl, I'm sure, is really happy to see that comment as well. And like I said, I'll have some others available real soon. There's another one coming up on Wednesday night that I'll be putting on my media page. So if you don't know, of course, my website is just simply lloydauerbach.com. You just have to remember to spell my name correctly. And that will take you, there is a page that is a media page, which lists a lot, not only as I'm getting links to new podcasts interviews that I've done. There are also many, many dozens of older ones. In fact, I still have to go back further in Google searches and YouTube searches because apparently there are things even from the early 2000s that I haven't added yet. I keep spotting a bunch of those. So you can see the evolution of Lloyd in some respects. All right. Let's see. You've noticed, let's see, Carl, I've noticed a lot in a lot of movies, the focus on 3 a.m. involving paranormal events. All right. Well, boy. So the 3 a.m. thing actually originally comes from, for the most part, comes from William G. Roll, one of our preeminent investigators, especially of poltergeist phenomena. I'm going to explain to you why 3 a.m. in a moment, but that was picked up by the folks on Ryan Buell and the other people on the TV show Paranormal State, and they declared that dead time, that was the best time to talk to spirits or to have activity happen. That's not what Bill Roll meant at all. At 3 a.m., two things are happening. Number one, in most places in the world, except maybe in some cities where there's a lot, they're 24-hour cities, 3 a.m., between 2 and 4 a.m., especially 3 a.m., is very quiet. And I mean environmentally quiet. I mean, there's not a lot of traffic outside. You don't have a lot of distractions. Quiet in the house, all of that. It is a time where, of course, at night in most places, the temperature has started to drop, and it may actually reach its lowest around 3 a.m. and then start coming back up. And there are other environmental issues that kind of flip at 3 a.m. as well. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the paranormal, but it is a good time for observation if there is activity. The problem is that the vast majority, and I'm talking about the huge vast majority of reported ghost sightings and experiences happen when the lights are on, during the day, in the evening, before people go to sleep, in the early morning, when people wake up. Has nothing to do with 3 a.m. specifically. Now, residual hauntings conceivably could have to do with 3 a.m. In fact, I had one in particular that the activity that was imprinted in the environment, the activity itself happened at 3 a.m. So the repeat of the activity was around 3 a.m. I had another case where there was a murder that was that was kind of imprinted in the environment that happened at 4 p.m. So when we talk about residual hauntings, they tend to relate to the time that the event actually was recorded, you might say, in that respect. But that's where the 3 a.m. thing comes from. And that was, once it was popularized as dead time, it's a nice catchphrase by Paranormal State. All these other people in the paranormal world started picking up on it. And again, not knowing where it came from, just assumed that was where ghosts appear because there is that folklore that nighttime is when ghosts happen. Just not the case necessarily. So that's where it comes from. All right. 3 knocks at 3 a.m. Yeah. Well, if you ask the ghost what time it is and they knock 3 times at 3 a.m., they're telling you the time. I don't know if there's anything much, I would ask them see if they can do more than that at midnight, for example. It used to be midnight, of course, was the witching hour. And then occasionally I'd hear people say that it was actually 1 a.m. because that could be considered, the 13th hour. If 12 midnight is the 12th hour, then 1 a.m. would be the 13th hour. And of course, there's that thing about 13 again. And interestingly enough, in some studies that were done looking at something called local sidereal time, which is solar time. It's basically based on where you are on planet Earth in relation to the position of the sun and the Earth, and the where and position of our system in relation to the center of the galaxy. And there's a period at which the Earth seems to be blocking a lot of, and the Earth's magnetic field is blocking a lot of static from the center of the galaxy. And that is at 1330 hours local sidereal time, at least in the northern hemisphere. It's probably a little different than the southern. And interestingly enough, 1330 hours is not 1:30 p.m. if you're on a 24-hour clock, because sidereal time is less than 24 hours. It's 23 hours, 56 minutes, and some seconds. So it shifts every day. But there's that 13 connection again. That's there. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and that is local sidereal time. You can actually get an LST clock. There's a bunch of free apps, local sidereal time apps, which will tell you where you are and what the local sidereal time is. So if you are looking to do something with a psychic, you might try doing it at 1330 or right around there. It's usually about a half an hour before and after, and see what you get for that. And that, by the way, is for things like remote viewing, for mediumship, for all sorts of information type psychic stuff, not so much the PK type of things, the mind over matter stuff. That's there. Your bladder wakes you up at 3 a.m. Yeah, I get about 2 a.m. and then about 4 something a.m., Carl. So comes with age. And interesting, and another thing that's interesting, and I do see this sometimes in articles about sleep as people get older. 3 a.m. seems to be depending on when you go to sleep in your sleep cycle, 3 a.m. is not too uncommon for people either for other things. So we have to consider it's nothing to do with the paranormal. At least I just hope that there's not a ghost out there tickling our bladders. All right. Yeah. So for some of you who are younger, you have a lot to look forward to going forward. All right. Let's change the subject to something else. I can mention until we get there, besides local sidereal time, which again is it's a correlation. It's not necessarily causation, but it does seem to make sense based on some studies. But this is based on looking at research in the lab in the northern hemisphere for the most part. So we really haven't looked at it. And things can be different in the southern hemisphere, geophysically and otherwise. So may not count if you're in Australia, for example. Just like astrology might be a little different down there because the stars are different at that point. The constellations are very different too, if you believe in astrology, that is. All right. So besides sidereal time, which seems to be this static from the center of the galaxy puts out a lot of stuff. One of the things that's important to know about our planet is, and most planets have what it's called a geomagnetic field. We have a field around the planet because of our liquid core and the spinning core of the Earth, and that field actually protects us from cosmic radiation, even some solar radiation that can be extremely harmful. But it fluctuates, and there have been connections between those fluctuations and people's psychic abilities too. Other planets have it. Mars, not so much. I mean, one of the things in talking to my late colleague, friend and mentor, Martin Caden, who was involved as a consultant to NASA in their history and was involved in a lot of different things. He had known most of the astronauts, knew the Mercury 7 and some of the others, and he was looking into the geomagnetic question in terms of Mars is concerned. He actually co-authored a book on Mars with Jay Barbary. And he was concerned that once you're outside the Earth's magnetic field, so be the Earth-Moon system on the way to Mars, unless that ship has a lot of shielding, there could be some significant problems. Who knows? Maybe all those cosmic rays will turn somebody into the Fantastic Four. I don't know. That's, the comic book thing. Randy says, would be interesting to check LSE coordinates to see if there's any correlation to historic haunt. Yeah, that would be interesting based on the timing. I do have to wonder if, not every haunting that people pick up on is the same time every day. Sometimes it like only occurs every so often at the same time. And maybe that's when LST flips around, comes around. Who knows? For poltergeist cases, I don't know that we've really been able to chart that as well. It wouldn't be hard to find out what the local sidereal time is for a location. I'm sure that there's data that can be found for things like when things were reported, the timing things were reported for the Enfield case. But we'd have to look at the specific time that an event happened and what the LST was. Same thing with the geomagnetic stuff. We'd have to look at that too. Okay, let's see here. If you were able to direct a science fiction movie over again, which one would you select? If I were able to direct a science fiction movie over again, boy, I can think of a couple of movies. Well, one is one of my favorite movies, which actually is, from what I understand, a new version of it is in development, um, with a couple of good writers. So I'm holding out hope it's going to be a good thing. Is Forbidden Planet, which was a 1956 film with Leslie Nielsen and Walter Pidgeon and Francis. A whole bunch of people are recognizable, and in some respects, was an inspiration for Star Trek. And it was one of the first big budget science fiction films that took place off our planet. Usually it was invaders coming to our planet, but this was one of the best ones. And I think that movie in itself, there's so much really cool stuff. In fact, the whole idea, if you've never seen that movie, you should watch it because it has some parallels to poltergeist phenomena, believe it or not, in a very odd way. Um, the other one actually, I think, has really potential to catch an audience these days is a movie called The Power. I was just talking about that recently to somebody. It's a 1968 film that starred who was that? George Hamilton, had Suzanne Pleshette, Michael Rennie in it, a number of other folks. And it starts out really interestingly, um, where this old scientist, Arthur O'Connell, I think it was, this old researcher, they're faculty at a university or in a think tank, and he gathers everybody together and he says, somebody in this group has been mutated, is a mutant from 100,000 years in the future and has psychic powers. And I'm pretty sure he or she's going to use it for bad intent. I have to watch the movie again. It's been a couple years since I've seen it. And he brings out what we have come to know as an energy wheel or as a psi wheel, basically a little paper pyramid balanced on a spindle. And he has everybody try to move it by thinking it moving. And of course, nothing happens. And then he realizes, of course, the person's not going to give themselves away. Let's all focus on it at the same time. And the thing starts spinning rapidly. And yes, he is right. The question is, the mystery is who done it, or who is that evil mutant person, and how do we find him, and what are the psychic powers that happen? And it has a bit of a twist ending to it, in fact, that I think is worth watching. And I think that would be a kind of a fun movie to bring out again. And yes, I am looking forward to disclosure for some personal reasons. Somebody I know is involved in, and that hopefully will end up on the screen too. I'm hoping that he does. So, um, yeah, Forbidden Planet was also, the ship for Forbidden Planet. Thanks for mentioning that, Randy. It was the ship itself, the C-57D, was an inspiration for the Jupiter 2 on Lost in Space. The interplay between the captain, the doctor, and others, and the first mate, you can almost see this is Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, even though there's no Vulcan here, but there is a robot, possibly the most famous robot in science fiction history, Robbie the Robot, who has since that movie, been in dozens of films and cameos and TV shows. He was even in an episode of Columbo at one point. He's on Lost in Space, but it's absolutely worthwhile. Yeah, The Power, excellent film. I would love to see a new version of that, especially with what we know about psychic ability and such. But I wouldn't necessarily go the mutant route, but I would. That's almost like an X-Men thing. But there's other ways to kind of portray that. But it's a really interesting mystery, and I think it's a really good movie to watch. So, there are a lot of movies. I would like to be involved in. But those are a couple really good science fiction ones. And pretty much anything Richard Matheson's written is worth watching. So you can find The Night Stalker, which was the first Kolchak movie, and The Night Strangler, both of which were written by Matheson, on YouTube. And if you know who Kolchak and The Night Stalker was, then great, good for you. But if you want to see a really good vampire movie, that's The Night Stalker. No relation at all, serial killers. Well, I guess he was a supernatural serial killer. He was a vampire, so yeah, interesting. All right. Anybody else have anything else? Remaking Rose Red. Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah. I've watched the Night Stalker not too long ago. Chasing Evil book, John Edward. Yeah, that would be kind of an interesting. I haven't read that book at all at this point. But that raises one other thing I think I can mention. There's a lot of talk all the time of evil entities. I honestly, I kind of twitch when somebody tells me there's a malevolent entity in somebody's house. It just doesn't fit what's normally going on. You could say harmful, potentially harmful, something like that, but pure evil is a whole different story. And I think what's really important for people to understand, because we think about evil and good as some spiritual powers very often, and religion talks about that. Some cultures do as well, obviously. Mythology certainly talks about that. But I highly recommend a book called The Science of Evil by Simon Baron Cohen. And the science of evil, in that he posits that and gives a really good case for this, that the evil that people do is because of a lack of empathy, that you can't put yourself in somebody else's place. That's the ultimate evil. People can actually justify anything they do to other people and almost anything they do because they have no empathy for other people. But there's more to it, in fact, and it's not about being evil being a force. It's just being about something that's maybe missing with either in our makeup, in certain people's makeup, or in just simply culture and education, teaching people. Because unfortunately, a lot of cultures teach you to be afraid of strangers, and therefore you don't have empathy for them. So there's quite a bit for that. Um, Randy, oh, the Medusa Touch, also a really interesting sci-fi slash horror film. There are a lot of films that often get labeled as horror, but they're just as much sci-fi, if not more. I mean, let's face it, the movie Alien and all the Alien movies are science fiction, but they're also sci-fi horror in many respects, mainly because they're not talking about magic there. You're sure you've talked about what do you think of Hans Holzer and his findings? So Holzer, I mean, I grew up reading Hans Holzer stuff. I read so many, and I still have a lot of the original paperbacks that I had bought when I was a kid. I mean, from the early mid '60s to the late '60s. I have a bunch of his other books as well. And Holzer was an interesting character. I was very fortunate to meet him. In fact, I was invited to his home as a high school student. So first, I need to let you know that in high school, I was already interested in parapsychology. I had started a parapsychology club at my high school. Um, had a lot of my fellow students, a couple of my teachers. Interestingly enough, the physics teacher and the earth science teacher were the two that helped sponsor that club. We did ESP experiments. We didn't do any ghostly stuff per se, but we did through some really chance connections. We did have lectures by a couple of people like Montague Ullman and Gertrude Schmeidler. Got to meet them, who lived in pretty close to where I was living. And my uncle Herb Norman was a radio newscaster for WMCA Radio in New York City. And MCA Radio was in the same building as the New York Institute of Technology, where Hans Holzer taught a parapsychology course. And he had met him a couple times. My uncle was a skeptic, and they never really talked about parapsychology. But he mentioned to Holzer one time that his nephew was involved in interested in parapsychology, and Holzer graciously invited me to his house in the Riverdale area of New York. And the one thing that impressed me the most, I mean, he was very welcoming. I talked to him quite a bit. His library, we met in his library. His library was amazing. Um, Books on, all sorts of science, not just parapsychology. I mean, Holzer started out as a journalist, and he was clearly had a lot of other interests. He had all the journals. He had the Journal of the ASPR and the Society for Psychical Research and the Journal of Parapsychology. He had all that stuff. So it was really, really bizarre to me that later on he seemed, and some of the stuff that I read back when I read back some of his other work, going back over that he kind of cashed in to some extent in the 70s on parapsychology. This was a time in the 70s when the TV show In Search of was on, and it was not just covering psychic things, obviously, it was covering all sorts of stuff. So Holzer wrote a book, which I still have, called The Handbook of Parapsychology, which has mostly stuff that has nothing to do with parapsychology. It talks about the Bermuda Triangle and Atlantis and cryptozoology, none of which is parapsychology. I suspect that was a publisher that had just, they contracted him to write the book and they told him what to put in it. I don't really can't blame him for that. But that was pretty bizarre. When I read that, and this was after I met with him, because if I had read that before, I would have really asked him about that. So it kind of bothered me at that point. Later on in life, I got to sit with him, and actually, you can find this on YouTube. If you type in YouTube Parapsychology Foundation, and you put my name in or Holzer's name in, you'll find that there's a two-part event that was recorded called The Science of Ghost Busting. It was myself, British investigator researcher Tony Cornell, my late colleague Carlos Alvarado, fellow graduate of JFK University's parapsychology program, and Hans Holzer. And frankly, at that point, Holzer was talking about things that didn't match his earlier stuff and was causing Tony Cornell. I'll just tell you what happened. Tony Cornell is sitting next to me, listening to Holzer talking about the definitive design or construct of the afterlife being 7 levels, and that you have to fill out paperwork to petition to go from one level to another, and that means waiting on long lines. And Cornell was grabbing my arm and squeezing it really hard to keep from laughing, which was really sad for me to see that. Um, yeah, so there are a couple other things. I think later in life, as people get older, sometimes they may lose a little bit of memory or other things, and I think that was going on. It was also really odd that he told 3 different people when they were asking him how old he was. He was in a wheelchair at that point, had a nurse with him, and he gave them 3 different ages in his 80s. So that was odd too. That might have been on purpose, though, I think, for that. But I do I mean, I still read, I still have read some of his earlier stuff, and I really like it. I think he focused too much with certain mediums who were convinced that all ghosts are unaware that they're dead. Um, and that could have been the type of cases he had too. But he had some other really good haunting cases and poltergeist cases as well. All right, that's enough about Holter right now. Let's see here. Let me go back up here and see what else we got. Let's see. Matheson wrote I Am Legend. That is, yeah, I Am Legend came out a long time ago, and there is actually a movie where Vincent Price plays a good guy. He plays the last survivor of the human race on a world of vampires. It's called The Last Man on Earth, and it's a pretty decent movie. I think it's actually public domain. So if you really want to see, what became the Omega Men, Omega Man, which was with Charlton Heston, and I Am Legend with Will Smith, neither of which really followed the book very well. The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price is really close to the book. If they had a special effects budget, I think they would have been a makeup budget, they would have done really well back then. Something, yeah, and that was something, yeah. Well, I Am Legend influenced a lot of people, actually, a lot of different things. Matheson had a lot of influence on folks, and Richard Matheson also, of course, he wrote the book Hell House and the Legend of Hell House, which is a great film. It's not as good as the movie it's an homage to, which is The Haunting, the 1963 film, which was directed by Robert Wise. But both films have a sense of reality to them. I Am Legend, I Am Legend, sorry, Legend of Hell House, that film. Matheson was incredibly knowledgeable about parapsychology. In fact, he even wrote a book called Mediums Rare about the history of mediumship. It's not a very long book. You can find it on Kindle, on Amazon, and I highly recommend it. My friend Barry Taft knew him very well, told me about his incredible library. So very knowledgeable of this stuff. Yeah. Last Man with Vincent Price was an Italian production, but it's in English and it's worth watching here. So it does seem to hold up well. I mean, that would be one that would be if you could do a good version of that today. But I hear there's going to be an I Am Legend 2. That's kind of the word that's been going around. And I don't know if that's really the case, but I kind of worry about that. Because again, it takes it away from the book quite a bit. Another Matheson book, which became a movie that's not too bad, since we are talking about movies, is Stir of Echoes, which is a really great book and a pretty decent film with Kevin Bacon. Took a little sidestep away from the actual book story a little bit, but the heart of the book is still there. And you may not have heard of the original Stir of Echoes because it came out a week after The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis, which got all the attention. And I think if Stir of Echoes had been held back for a few months after the furor died down over, I See Dead People, that probably would have done very well. I actually think it's a really good book, a good film, and it does hold up very well. The sequel that was done for TV, not so good. Had nothing to do with it. But I do recommend that. I mean, if we're talking about movies that deal with the paranormal and things like that, that's an interesting film because it's not. There's definitely some scary stuff in the sense that people reacting in certain ways, but it's not a scary movie per se. Just like The Sixth Sense was not a scary film. So I do recommend those movies as well. All right, other kind of put us off on a really good. I love talking about movies and TV shows, so that this is a good topic for tonight in general. And Kevin Bacon was very good in that. Um, Not as good, I think, as he was in the Guardians of the Galaxy Christmas special from a couple of years ago, and that's still on Disney Plus. But that's my preference. Just that's when he played himself. All right. Anybody else right off the bat? So while we're waiting, I'll say, films, movies, TV shows, that provides an entry for a lot of folks, especially the scripted stuff, into the paranormal, into psychic phenomena. Psychics have been portrayed on TV in so many different ways. In fact, I was just watching last week's episode of Will Trent on ABC, and there's a young guy who comes in to see the detectives. He's worried about his neighbor, and he thinks that her body may be that she's dead, and her body may be someplace. And he's got these visions that he sees. And the two detectives don't believe him, but they plug the piecemeal stuff into Google or something like that, and they find some possibilities. And yeah, they find the body. And then there's more. They're going to arrest the guy because, of course, that's what happens on TV is that the person who's the psychic or says they're a psychic must be the perpetrator. And that has been the case in some older cop shows where it was a fake psychic who was trying to find out what the police knew by pretending to be psychic. That's not where this one actually took a turn, which was a good turn. So it's a good episode of Will Trent from last week. Psychics have not always been portrayed well on television. Some, like the TV show Medium, did portray things fairly well, although Alison Dubois herself did not. Her personality was not the same as the characters, her actual personality. And she didn't dream her stuff. She actually is a medium and communicated with spirits in different outside the dream world, which Patricia Arquette's character on the TV show Medium did everything was to their dreams in other ways. And there have been psychics portrayed in other ways, but of course, people with psychic abilities have been portrayed in different ways as well. There are good and there's bad. When we come to ghosts and poltergeists, and then it goes in all different directions. But the thing you have to remember is if you were to look at the number of films that have a ghost in them and really categorize them. And we're going back to, let's just say to the early 1930s. We're not going to go into the silent films. If you look at most of the films that had a ghost in them, an actual ghost of a human being, you're going to find that the majority of them are categorized either as dramas or just as likely comedies. Those are the categories, and the ghosts are portrayed as human beings, very, very human. Those movies are a lot closer to reality than the horror films. Horror films, there's a reason for horror films. It's because we like to be scared. We like the adrenaline rush, all of that. So twisting the stories, twisting the legends, adding other things to it is a way to deal with that theme, to bring it in. And then, of course, you can go easily into non-human, non-corporeal entities and deal with those kinds of things, or mythology, like whether it's biblical mythology, like demons and angels, or you can go in a different direction with other kinds of myths, or even make up your own, which people often do. Certainly, we do that in science fiction with things. Um, then, of course, you have one of the most commonly cited examples or movie series. It's actually more than a movie series these days that deals with psychic phenomena, even not, well, it's not overtly stated that way, is, of course, the Star Wars universe. Because the Force is nothing, the expressions of the Force are psychic expressions of psychokinesis, of telepathy, of clairvoyance, of all of that, precognition. Those things come through constantly. And of course, that's all part of Star Trek, too. The Uninvited, also a good classic film. More of a, it did not, you're right, it didn't portray them as human, nor does The Haunting or The Legend of Hell House, but those things are really portrayed more as residual hauntings of a different type in many films. The Uninvited is different, but it's more of a suspense film that I'd say that it's not really a horror film. I wouldn't classify that anyway. There are a lot more thrillers and such. Yeah, and more sensory based. That's right, feeling things. And The Others, great film uh, with Nicole Kidman, with a Twilight Zone ending to it, which I really, when I first saw it, I didn't see it coming immediately. Um, and there are other films like that. Excuse me. That similar even before The Others that are worth watching. There was a movie with Aidan Quinn, and the name just escapes me right now. But he played an investigator for a British organization. And again, there's a twist ending for that. So you can find some really interesting films. I'll tell you one that doesn't hold up is the remake of The Haunting, which had Liam Neeson and Catherine Zeta-Jones. It just doesn't, it really doesn't hold up in so many different ways. But The Others is a really good classic Victorian ghost story from a different perspective. So definitely worth seeing as well. TV, I think I've mentioned before in this, I've certainly talked about this in classes and in my lectures, that when I was a little kid, um, there were shows that from the early 50s that were being syndicated, and they were still showing into the mid 60s and even later than that. So when I was a little kid, of course, cartoons included Casper the Friendly Ghost, which really to me didn't count like a ghost. But there was a show called Topper, and Topper was and still is. I mean, I ended up getting a lot of episodes through someone who would record them and was selling, you know, knockoffs. There really is not a set of Topper episodes that covers the entire series. So I was able to get a bunch more episodes. And it's a show that pretty much holds up to this day in other ways. It's based on, and if you really want to read some fun fiction, look up an author named Thorne Smith. He wrote humorous novels in the 1920s and early 30s. And Thorne Smith wrote a book called Topper. A little bit different than the TV series. The series took a slightly different tact. The movie Topper, which came out in the 1930s, which is on YouTube, stars Cary Grant as one of the ghosts. And that's a little closer to the book. It's absolutely worth reading the book, and also the second one, which is Topper Takes a Trip. And the TV series with Leo G. Carroll and Anne Jeffries and Robert, his name escapes me right now, her husband, actually her husband in real life. There was a couple who were clients of a banker named Cosmo Topper, and he was their friend, and he ended up being their beneficiary as well. And they went skiing, and they were in an avalanche. And Saint Bernard, with a brandy cask, tried to rescue them. Of course, that's kind of the stereotype. And but they were killed in the avalanche. So Cosmo and his wife inherited the house. Well, the Kirbys, the couple, and the dog Neil came back to the house, and only Topper could see them. And hilarity ensues because the ghost could do things, they could move things, they could show up only to him. The thing about that really got me as a kid, first of all, the comedy's good. Special effects are really interesting considering this is a show from the mid 50s. Really good. And this taught me that ghosts can change their clothes, and apparently ghosts can also drink booze. Not that that really happens, but the changing clothes thing does happen, and that there are animal ghosts. So they really kind of played that up quite a bit, and that was really haunted. Thank you very much, Randy. It's a really good book, good movie rather. But Topper is a great series. There are a few episodes of Topper that are on YouTube. You can also find a few on Tubi and probably some of the other streaming services, although it tends to be the same episodes. Worth watching, at least one, to kind of get a feel for it. So that's what I was watching when I was like 3 and 4 and 5 years old. That was my intro to ghosts. And then, of course, in the 60s, we had The Ghost and Mrs. Muir and a few other shows. And there were movies that I was watching. In New York, we had Abbott and Costello films running pretty much every Sunday, as well as Tarzan films running every Sunday. And there's my favorite of all time ghost movie, which I've seen dozens of times over the years, is a movie called The Time of Their Lives. It is an Abbott and Costello film. Excuse me. If you think you don't like Abbott and Costello, this movie's for you because they don't do any of their routines. This was a scripted film, had nothing to do with them being Abbott and Costello, although Costello, as a comedian, was kind of acting up. And he plays a tinker in the Revolutionary War who is on a mission to deliver something on a mission for George Washington. And unfortunately, he and the lady of this one colonial house get mistaken for British spies by the Continental Army and are killed. And their bodies are dumped into a well. And the guy from the Continental Army curses them as British spies until such time as they can prove they weren't. And their ghosts are locked to that estate, kind of like the ghosts on the TV show Ghosts. And it's a really good film. Then it jumps to the 20th century. Bud Abbott plays the butler in the original house, but then he plays a psychiatrist with people who have actually come back to restore the house. So it's a really excellent film. It's got a great seance scene at the very end as well. And it has a very goofy Costello twist. It's kind of the last thing that happens, but it's definitely worth watching. All right. Did I ever watch The Ghost Monsieur? Yeah, I just mentioned that one, of course. The remake of House on Haunted Hill was a really interesting film. I thought that was kind of especially with the skeleton thing, not the best special effects. I think the remake probably was better on that one. Television show Ghost has a ghost snail. Yeah, that's right. The Ghosts had a ghost snail recently. That's right. Paul, I'm so much older than you at this point. You were 12 when Ghostbusters came out. All right. Well, that's fine. That's fair. So, boy, you would have been the age of the kid in one of my cases, kind of a landmark case I had. And I'll just mention this one a little bit. In very early 1985, he was 12 and a half. He had seen Ghostbusters, and he was communicating with the ghost of the woman who owned the house and had died a year and a half before, more than a year and a half before. He was communicating with her on a daily basis, even though, and the rest of the family didn't know he was communicating with her, although the rest of the family saw the ghost every once in a while and just didn't bother, just kind of ignored her. So it was a really good case with a lot of great information that came through. I did a huge write up of the case in Leslie Kean's book, Surviving Death. So it's was a really the best thing about the case was the amount of family information that came in the communication between the boy and the woman, um, that I had to track down her only living relative to confirm, and he confirmed it all. Plus her commentary through the boy as to why she stuck around, which was because she didn't know if there was a heaven or hell and figured why take a chance, and also what she thought of herself. What was her form, and how come she could change her clothes and her age and all that. It was all stuff that typical 12-year-old would never have found anywhere at that time, not easily. Uh, yeah, your cousin. Okay, yeah, uh, a couple of my coworkers at this point, at my day job, I'm the age of their parents, so weird. It's very fairly weird. Yeah. Then again, yesterday morning I was speaking to an over 55 gated community club called the Life After Life Club down in Laguna Hills, California, so Orange County. So I wasn't the youngest person in the room because a couple of people I knew came, but I was mainly the youngest person in the room. Always interesting too. So, and that lecture will be up. In fact, I did a lecture there for them. If you go to YouTube and plug in Life After Life Club, they have had some really good speakers over the years, and certainly besides me. But I did do a talk for them about a year and a half ago. This talk that I did yesterday on apparitions will be up on their YouTube channel. I think they said within the month. So, and I'll probably, in fact, that first talk I did for them is linked on my media page, so you can find it there. Thanks, Paul. Yeah. So I'm trying to keep up with those as they send me the links. A lot of more folks are doing editing these days instead of just putting them up live. So I have to wait in some respects. All right. Any substantive parapsychology questions anybody has for our last, what is it, 11 minutes at this point? Because I can keep talking about TV and movies all along without any problem. And I'll just give it a moment to see if anybody has anything. I will say the Ghost and Mr. Chicken, you had to go there. Okay. All right. If you're interested in vampires, look up a movie called Old Mother Old Mother Riley Meets the Vampire. Yeah. Very bizarre British film with Bela Lugosi, as it happens. Very goofy film. And there are certainly a lot of very goofy comedies out there with ghosts. Um, the the newer version of the Haunted Mansion was pretty good, I thought. The Eddie Murphy version was meh, but but the newer version much better. What We Do in the Shadows for vampires, yeah. Um, I really couldn't say enough good things about that show. It's one of the best shows having vampires at all. It's actually one of those best documentary type shows out there, I think. Especially when they had the fight with the werewolves. That was fun. And when they had the council meeting with all the past, so many actors who had played vampires in other movies were there too. Very, very cool. The Frighteners. I forgot to mention that one. That was one of Peter Jackson's earliest films. Michael J. Fox is in it. That's a really good film, and for a number of reasons. Beside the fact that it starts out with him being a con artist partnered with some ghosts, which I thought was a really genius idea. Um, the evil ghost, because there is an evil ghost in there, and there's a reason the guy is evil, who this represents, but it's a little bit of a really interesting twist the idea that when you're a ghost, you can look like anything you want. And I do for that very reason, I recommend The Frighteners. It's a good film. I definitely enjoyed that. It is fun. It is a comedy, but it's got some overtones of suspense and thriller in it too. which is really good. I think that's some of the best films that are out there are like that. Um, and there actually are some good books out there about, more scholarly books, so like looking deeply into some of these films. If I had known we're going to get off on this topic, I would have kind of pulled out I have a book called The 50 Best Ghost Movies Ever, which came out about 20 years ago, so it's not up to date, but it had some movies that I had never heard of, which I've since tracked down. Um, and the other thing you can do, there's stuff on YouTube and on the Internet Archive. You'll be able to find some silent films, short films, where they were experimenting in showing ghostly figures in cinema. And in many respects, their special effects were pretty good comparatively. And there is on stage, there's an effect called Pepper's Ghost, which you can look up. It was created by someone almost as a magic trick, but it became a theatrical thing. And unfortunately, the guy who created it never really got credit until recently. But it is something that you can actually make a translucent or transparent ghost appear on a stage. So live, which is interesting, especially considering it was the late 1800s that this was first used. It's used in a lot of other ways. In fact, at the Haunted Mansion, it's used. If you have been to either of the Haunted Mansions and you're on that ride and you go past the room where they're all dancing and floating, and you can see them, you can see through them. And as you're looking through that huge pane of glass that's there, looking down on the room, that is because of Pepper's ghost illusion. So it's actually a fairly easy illusion to come up with, to create. All right. Oh yeah, the series of ghost movies called House, scary and funny at the same time. Yeah, I think scary and funny is good. Horror comedies can be a lot of fun. Evil Dead movies are like that, at least the ones that Sam Raimi directed. Well, and one of my all-time favorite movies is actually Army of Darkness. So that is, even though it's not as much of a horror film as the other ones. Um, some medium's pretty good. Why don't we have a better picture of the other side? Well, there's a medium here who might be able to answer that, but I think the main reason is because the other side, when you're without a body in the spirit world, that world is probably more different than we can relate to. So when mediums communicate with people on the other side and they get a description, it is filtered through what we know, what mediums know, what living humans know through living perceptions. And that makes it very difficult to describe what that is. I mean, science fiction writers can get very good, and special effects CGI people can create alien creatures, but this is kind of life as we know it and also extrapolating on life as we know it. But there could be forms of life out there that we can't even imagine at this point. So it's a really difficult thing to say what the other side is like. That people are, their experiences on the other side is a different story. What they feel, how they relate to people, that kind of thing is a different story. All right. I always wondered if a ghost could take any form it wanted, like what would stop an operation from Yeah, that's true. Technically, according to that, to to the ghost that we spoke to, actually through this kid and to other people who have had communication, generally apparitions are seen according to their self-image, how we think of ourselves. And I'm even talking about that. Think about how you picture yourself in your head. There are very few, if any, certainly if any, in our culture, in Western culture, naked ghosts. And that makes no sense. It's like, where do ghosts get their clothes from? Well, that's part of their self-image. Why is it that when people see someone, a relative who's died, if that relative was 95, they don't see them as a 95-year-old person. They see them typically looking in their prime, healthy, unlike in the movie The Sixth Sense, because it's a self-image. We all have a picture of ourselves that is often different, younger, better looking, in different clothing perhaps than what is reality. When I've done college lectures over the years and large scale lectures, I used to actually do something to ask people to close their eyes and picture themselves. And then when they open their eyes, they ask them, how many of you thought of yourselves down to your shoes? And the percentage was about 5%. And of that 5% of the audience, 5 or 6% of the audience thought of themselves down to the shoes. Many ghosts are seen only down to their knees or approximately down there. The 5% who saw themselves down to their shoes, when I asked, okay, keep your hands up if you raise your hand for that. Put your hands down. Uh, keep your hands up if you buy a lot of shoes. And about half those people lowered their hands. So of that 5%, 2.5% approximately were people who bought a lot of shoes. So they always thought of themselves having shoes. And that's why that self-image was included. But technically, I guess there'd be no reason for someone to imagine themselves looking differently, different sex or otherwise. Certainly, again, this is a good reason to watch The Frighteners, because that sort of happens, not with a sex change, but with something else as well, kind of a different self-image. Um, Paul, you're still hopeful to see an real apparition. Well, as I think I've mentioned before, I've never actually had a visual sighting. I've had a mental image, but definitely not a visual. But I've had auditory and olfactory smell, and sense people, sense certain things. And also been on the USS Hornet, I've been patted on the back and had my arm squeezed when I when I actually a joke was kind of pulled on me in some respects. Japanese ghost stories. Yeah, if you look at ghost stories in other cultures, you will find different traditions. But you can look at ghost stories even in Western culture in general. Native American ghost stories. You can look at ghost stories from the Brits before Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is known as the father of the modern ghost story. He didn't just write one ghost story, A Christmas Carol. He wrote a bunch. But there are ghost stories from before that, and some of them are scary. And this goes back to storytelling in general. And again, why we even have horror films, why we have horror stories, why we have scary stories at all, is that adrenaline rush. So people would make up stories to scare people. The people they're telling the stories to. Japanese ghost stories refer back to the Japanese mythology as well, and you'll see the same thing in other places around the world. Let's see here. Where am I? Just trying to catch up here as we go to our last piece here. And I'm missing somebody here. Wow. There's a lot. All of a sudden, there's a lot of stuff at the very end here. So, vampire TV shows, Forever Night. That was a good show. Actually, the movie, the pilot was that starred Rick Springfield, as it happens. Not the guy who Gerard, can't remember his name, who starred in the movie later on. Used to create Pepper's Ghost of the Haunted Houses you worked in. Yeah, very cool. That's very cool. Paul Rubens had a small part in the Blues Brothers. Yeah, he did. There are shows on YouTube that show you how to set up the ghost effects for your house. There have been books about creating a haunted house, and there are a lot of YouTube videos on that kind of stuff, which includes Pepper's Ghost. I've seen some good videos on Pepper's Ghost as well. So Kathy bringing the darkness into the light. I can see them sometimes in a chair with their legs crossed, often the same as family remembers. So that is a lot of times ghosts, will show up to the family members. They want to be looking like how they were when they were alive as well. Let's see here. You don't like it when the pseudo-skeptics say telepathy and parapsychology ain't real. You know what? It's not even worth debating them sometimes, honestly, because they're not going to even listen. I can say, and I've dealt with that with a number of the pseudo-skeptics over the years, including the amazing Randy. If they say, well, how do you know this is real? I said, well, we've had controlled research and people experience all of this. At the very least, this is the one thing I always say to them, millions of people have had experiences we have labeled psychic, whether they are or not. We have unusual results in laboratory experiments. We have patterns that have emerged here. And yet psychology ignores these patterns. Psychology ignores these experiences. I thought science was about trying to get to the heart of the matter, trying to get to the root of things. And even if you believe that these are not real, they're worth studying. These experiences are human. They're worth studying. That's it. And I just leave it at that. And if they don't want to look at the research, then it's just too bad. I can't convince them of something that they're not willing to look at the evidence. In fact, there have been skeptics who have written articles that start out by saying, I didn't bother looking at the data because this stuff is impossible. Well, okay, fine. If you think it's impossible, why are you even asking me to debate with you or talk to you about this? It's not worth it. Not worth my time. So that's always an important thing to remember for yourselves. All right, we're kind of past time. So I want to just encourage everybody to like and subscribe. Thank you all for your time. Thanks for giving me the movies to riff off of a little bit here. So we went off on a different tack today. And yes, Paul, yes, Phone Calls from the Dead is really good. It's the book by Raymond Bayless and Scott Rogo is excellent if you can get a used copy of it. I actually think it's been reprinted, but Telephone Calls from the Dead by Callum Cooper is the sequel, you might say, more modern version and study of this, and definitely worth taking a look at that. All right, thanks everybody. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another Ask Professor Paranormal. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions or topics you'd like me to address, and you can think of those before the show, please feel free to send me an email to askprofparanormal. I'm just putting it in the chat at gmail.com, if I can type. It's also in the channel description, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Good night, everybody.